Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you all in this gorgeous city. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be speaking with you about the psychology behind multi-screen user behaviors. I will make the slides available afterwards later in the day, so don't feel like you have to frantically jot down notes. Before we begin though, I want to start with a little quick quiz. So by show of hands, who here is a desktop user? Who here is a mobile user? And how about tablet? Okay. So we have a bit of a problem on our hands. While it is true that we need to design differently across different devices, businesses are trying to segment their users specifically by device. Not all businesses, but many businesses. And the problem is that we actually use a range of devices for increasingly similar things. So it's true, I'm not going to whip out my tablet or my desktop to call an Uber or to get a Google map to the hot date that I have or whatever it might be. But increasingly, our behaviors are becoming increasingly device agnostic. So even though we have different ways of interacting, many of our goals, needs, and motivations when using different devices are becoming more and more similar. So instead of optimizing specifically for devices, we need to start optimizing, psychologically speaking, for a multi-screen experience. And there are various ways that we can do this. And the way that I would like to propose today is to look at some of the psychological drivers that are actually sitting behind our decision-making so that we can then apply them across the board. You might apply them in different ways, but the execution will always depend on the experience. So there are 4 different principles that I want to look at today. The first is cognitive load. The second is processing fluency. The third is my favorite, hedonic adaptation. And the fourth, one that we are all pretty familiar with, I will guess, is dopamine loops. So first of all, cognitive load. So this essentially is the load that performing a specific task, whatever that task might be, places on your cognitive system. Or in layman's terms, it's the total amount of mental effort that you are spending at any given time on a particular task. So if I got you guys over here to do tax returns, you would probably hate me, but also the mental effort involved in that task would be much greater, and so you'd have a high cognitive load. If you guys over here were trying to pull me a pint of Guinness, which would be much appreciated, you'd probably have a low degree of mental effort and therefore a low cognitive load. And this is important because we all have an extremely limited capacity for cognitive processing, which means that wherever possible, we'll try and take shortcuts. So if you want to encourage your customers to convert, you have to lower the amount of mental effort that you are demanding from them to engage with you, whatever the device. So the king of low cognitive load design is, of course, Amazon, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And they do several things, both from a psychological and a technical perspective, to lower the amount of mental effort demanded of their clients. The first thing to say is when you're coming onto a site and you're trying to make a decision as to who to buy from, we look for cues from other people to see what the best option is. So here you have a quantifiable cue of ratings. Typically, some research that I did with Unilever found that if you get ratings of 3.9 stars and above, but not straight 5s, because that looks a bit dubious, you're much more likely to get an increase in conversions. Anything below around 3.8 can actually sometimes have a negative effect, so that's something to look out for. The second point to make is you're much more likely to go for a vendor that has loads of reviews with a slightly lower rating because it's kind of been validated by the crowd. I shall move out of the way so you can see this. The second thing to note from a logistical perspective is the one click. And of course, everyone started trying to find ways to do this. But the psychology behind why it works is really fascinating. There's a few things that it does. Number one, it simplifies a complex series of tasks, reducing the cognitive load and the mental effort. And number two, it removes the pain of paying. Now, if I was going to come up to you and basically say to you, okay, I either want you to give me a £5 or I'm going to pinch you, you probably wouldn't want to do either. But what's interesting is that in either of those scenarios, you get quite similar brain activity because the physical pain of being pinched and the mental pain of giving me physical money is quite similar. Which is why if you can remove that sense of contact, so removing currency symbols, whether it's a euro sign, a dollar sign, a sterling sign, or you can remove the transactional element, so tapping to pay, which is very smart, or buy now with one click, you're going to reduce the pain of paying, make the process easier, and so the whole thing feels a lot more pleasurable. So there's an example that I'd like to give of a particular company that reduces mental effort really well. bar store. It's based in the UK. And what they do is they basically simplify what is otherwise a very laborious, painful, and complex checkout experience by segmenting each specific bit into a single tangible action. And only once you've completed that specific bit do they allow you to move on to the next. The other thing that the more psychologically astute of you might have noticed is they also have little green tabs, so that once you've completed one, they're giving you a very Western culture specific bit of positive reinforcement as well as a tick. It's a nice little nudge. Another great example of lower cognitive effort can be seen in this campaign. So the guy that headed up the CRO team, Carl Rush, I don't know where he is now, but he does really interesting work. It's worth checking him out. Started out the campaign with this, where is he?
Hillary Clinton.
Oh, well, there we go, Hillary Clinton, get in. Well, let's not even go into that. Anyway, see what he does with her conversion rates. Oh, that's a thorny subject. Right, so maybe it's best safer territory with Obama. So this is the original page that they had. And as you can see, if you're landing on that, whatever device you're using, no one's really going to want to sit through that and go through all the fields. And you're already preempting how much time it's going to take you. So most of us would probably not be that positive about giving all the information. So what did they do? They did a couple of really interesting things to lower the cognitive load. Number one, they divided the page into two segmented chunks. So visually speaking, when you scan it, there's dark at the top, light at the bottom. I know this is super simple, but the visual system works in this way, so it's worth knowing about. So by having the image at the top and the eye gaze is directed towards the call to action, straight away you're shown exactly which part of the page to attend to. Second, just like we've seen in previous examples, they've divided a complex process into single, tangible chunks, and they've identified where you are in the stage of checking out. From a cultural perspective, it's really worth noting that countries that score high for uncertainty avoidance, so actually the UK is very uncertainty embracing, but for countries that aren't, the more easily you can identify to your customers where they are in a process, the more likely they are to convert. So anyway, so that's what they do here. And then to reduce choice paralysis, they give you a whole bunch of pre-selected sort of offers, I suppose, that you can put in, or the opportunity to enter whatever amount you want, reducing mental effort. What's really curious about this is that even though they've done all of this stuff, in the second version, there is so much more text. And yet, because it's described in a much different way visually to the text here, it feels like you can just ignore it. So that's a couple of different ways that you can actually increase conversions, and they made millions worth of extra dollars simply from making these visual tweaks. So if you want to use this, you have to figure out a way to reduce the number of actions required to get people from A to B, split your complex processes into single steps. Even if they don't feel complex to you, your customers will thank you for it. And then minimize the visual clutter by chunking design elements in a way that makes sense. Okay. Psychological principle number 2 is processing fluency. And this is the ease with which we process information in our environment, whether on or offline. And basically, the rule is that content that is easy to process, so it's high in cognitive fluency, it's easy for you to figure out, is usually going to be perceived as more trustworthy to that which is less fluent. And the reason for this is if you read something that makes sense, you then imbue the brand that's giving you that message with the same level of fluency, so you trust it more. And there are 4 different little types of fluency that I want to talk with you about quickly. So the first, repetition. This is something that we all, I'm guessing with our age, grew up with in the TV era. And this is when you see or hear a statement repeatedly, so it could be a jingle or whatever it is. When we see or hear something again and again, even if we don't remember having seen or heard it, we're more likely to rate it to be true. And this is why repetitive calls to actions can work if used appropriately, and why phrases and jingles tend to be more memorable. Hands up if you remember this one. Washing machines live longer with chemical. Anyone? Oh, shit, don't leave me hanging. That's like 4 of us. No! I was trying to think of like a more recent one, but I can't think of any because I don't really listen to the radio. Maybe that's a sign of our times. All right, so the second type of processing fluency is around structure. And this is something that you might not explicitly recognize, but when I show you, you'll probably think, oh, okay. So for this, if you use a message whose structure your customers will implicitly learn, when they see something similar at a later date, it will feel familiar. And because of the mirror exposure effect, which is basically something that you've seen, it feels familiar, you're more likely to trust it, they'll be much more likely to process it quickly and again feel a sense of connection with your brand. One brand that does this really well is Nike. So remember, we're looking for the structure here. So we all know this particular mantra, just do it. When they launched their video campaign, Find Your Greatness, the branding wasn't splashed all over the thumbnails. It wasn't splashed all over the content. And yet, because the font is the same and the structure is the same, the three-word punchline, there's an implicit association with the brand that helps us feel more comfortable with it. It's actually very clever. The third type of processing fluency that I want to talk about is perceptual fluency, and this is making something as visually clear as possible. Of course, Google does this extremely well. You've got one thing that draws your attention, the beautiful colors on the page, and then a single call to action, or two if you're counting the ones at the bottom. So perceptually, it's visually clear what the purpose is and what the branding is. Another great example, how many here have heard of Headspace, the meditation app? Okay, quite a few. So I use this, and it's really wonderful. And their perceptual fluency is actually really high, both on the desktop experience and also in the mobile experience. So when you land on the desktop, you see something like this. First of all, there's a nice, well, mostly a single kind of active color, a bit of a message, single call to action. When you actually start the 10-day free trial, where you get a free meditation every day, the way that they break it up into steps means that at any given time, you've only got one thing to attend to, and because the design is so simple, it feels visually very pleasing. And this perceptual fluency even carries on onto the app. A couple of things to point out here. The branding is obviously similar. You've got the congratulation message, and actually it's pretty symmetrical. And we tend to find symmetrical images easier to process perceptually, and we also find them more attractive. And again, a single call to action. So perceptually, it's very fluent. The nutshell here is that if your interface is easy to use, typically most of us will experience pleasure. And if we experience pleasure, it will increase purchase intent and the likelihood that people will return or continue to use your product or your app. The final bit that I want to talk about in terms of processing fluency is around the linguistic use. And this is making things phonologically simple, which is a bit funny because actually that's not a phonologically simple way of explaining it. But we'll get to that, it's fine. So let's use OkCupid as an example. Phonologically simple messages use simple words, usually words of few syllables, and they won't use long sentences or hard-to-read fonts. So with all of this in mind, would you say that this is fluent or disfluent? Hands up for fluent. Simple, easy to read, good fonts. Okay, most of us. Okay, so basically, join the best free dating site on earth. Phonologically, it's simple language, sans serif font, easy to read. You know exactly what you're getting. Brilliant. There are a lot of brands that also use this approach, well, either consciously or unconsciously, in their logos, especially in the States. All of these brands use some kind of Helvetica-based font. And what's interesting is that when you use Helvetica, or for instance Arial, these high-quality fonts have actually been found to boost processing fluency, so we recognize them faster, we process them as more trustworthy. They can also induce a positive mood, which is just extraordinary. So when you see these brands, you get a sense of maybe recognition, of familiarity, maybe of comfort. They also make information a lot easier to process and instructions simpler to follow. So if I were to give you guys a simple set of instructions in sans serif, say Helvetica, and you guys something in, I don't know, some italicized, like Edwardian script, you'd find it easier to follow the instructions. You complete them quicker than you guys over here. And it's not to do with IQ, it's just to do with the way in which they're processing the linguistics. So if you want to use this, there's a couple of very simple things that you can do. Number one, increase the contrast between the text and its background. Use easy-to-read sans serif fonts. Simplify your language, and then have a direct and very simple and concrete call to action. Has to be said at this point that, of course, no silver bullet exists, and there are instances in which using disfluent fonts that are harder to process will actually serve you better. So this could be if you're using a font to describe a risky experience that people can take. So it might be, I don't know, Alton Towers rides, whatever it is. The harder the font is to read, the more risk people feel in association with it, and if that's congruent with the message or the product, people feel like they're getting something that's congruent, that makes sense. Also, if you want your comprehension to be better, sometimes it helps to read stuff that's in hard-to-read font because your mental effort going into it will be higher. And also for unique luxury goods, that can also be a better approach. So those little caveats in place. So the third principle that I want to talk about is hedonic adaptation. And this is the idea that people become accustomed to both positive and negative stimuli over time, and that the emotional effects of that stimulus then actually gets attenuated, so it changes, it decreases. So it's the same thing as to whether, if your brother farts next to you and you're watching TV, if you leave the room, it's going to be a lot more gross coming back in than if you just stayed there. So basically, I speak from experience, sorry. So basically, over time, we become desensitized or bored of the same thing, and that can be features, concepts, and rewards, but it also applies to other things like apps, games, products, and even relationships. So to have a little bit of a walkthrough of what this might feel like, how many of you played this when it came out? Okay, most of us, don't be shy. Okay, I did too. I was like, oh my God, they're so cute and round and funny, and some of them look angry. So you start with this excitement, the novelty value. You've got high arousal. Everybody's using it. You've got social proof. You've got all this hype. It's like Pokemon Go. I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. Novelty, high arousal, in you go, really exciting. And then after a while, you start realizing that it's not that fun anymore, and so your attention drops, the emotional stimulus drops, and you get bored. So what do? They bring out another one. And it's familiar, so you're like, ooh, that's familiar, I trust it, I know what to expect, but it's a little bit novel, let's try that instead. So your arousal goes up because the novelty's up, and eventually, again, that emotional response attenuates over time. So what do? They bring out another. And you start to see this pattern of arousal in relationship with novelty that gets repeated over and over again. And you don't find this simply with apps, you also find it with any kind of service to which people become accustomed because they rely on it or they're using it over a longer period of time. An interesting thing here, just as an aside, how many of you use eBay? And when it first came out, who were like the early adopters? Okay, a few of us. So I don't know if you remember, those who were the early adopters, when it had a yellow page in the background, it was a yellow. Does anyone remember that? All right, so those of us who used it with a yellow background, and it was really vibrant, you're like, this is great. I'm so much on the fringe, I'm an outlier, early adopter, this is brilliant. And then suddenly they changed it overnight to a white background. And people got really pissed off. They're like, what have you done to our platform? This doesn't feel familiar, it's not like home. So there was a huge outcry, and of course they had to change it back. But what people didn't realize was that instead of just leaving it yellow, as originally, because if you go on now, it's white, instead of leaving it yellow, they ended up stretching out the migration, well, not really the migration, the adaptation from yellow to white. Over a period of time, it's like turning the heat on a frog, and it doesn't realize it's boiling. And so there were all these boiling frog eBay users that didn't realize what had happened. And of course, no one complained because they couldn't tell it had happened. So a similar thing, like we don't really, notice things if they're done over time. So we notice difference most of all. So how can we use hedonic adaptation in the products or the platforms that we're creating? Number one, you can update your product frequently. The degree of frequency will depend, of course, on the expectations of your customers, on the type of product, on the context of your users. The second thing to do is to change the layout and structure. And you can do this by tweaking it. So the trick is to find a comfortable space in between novelty and familiarity. You can also alter the user experience, make the rewards unpredictable, which we'll be coming back to, and then essentially, if you can get that to work in any sort of device, you're probably going to end up with higher engagement over a longer period of time. So these principles will work mostly across all devices, even though their application might be a little bit different in each scenario. But there is one principle in particular that is specific to mobiles. And I want to throw it out there because I feel like you're a smart audience, so let's try this and see how we go. What do you think these following platforms have in common? And bear in mind, we're before Watershed, so let's try and keep it clean. Tinder, we've got Tinder. We've got Twitter or other infinite scrolls. And also notifications across our mobile devices. What do you think they have in common? Does anyone want to have a guess? Scroll? They do have a scroll, yeah. What else? The right triggers, yes. Brilliant, thank you. This is our plant for the night. Okay, so yes, they all trigger, but they trigger something in particular, and those things that they trigger, that thing that triggers is the dopamine system. So dopamine was kind of discovered in the late 1950s by two Swedish researchers, and it's been found that dopamine is critical for a whole variety of different things, including our mood, including our attention, motivation, thinking, moving, sleeping, but most interestingly for us, dopamine is one of the primary causes of pleasure-seeking behavior of all kinds. So for example, if we're thinking about post-conference drinks, Hopefully, because we started a bit late today and we've got great speakers, you won't get too bored. But by the end of the day, you might want a bit of pleasure. So what do? Your dopamine system kicks in and you think, oh, I want something a bit stimulating or arousing or whatever floats your boat. And so you'll take action. I should have probably used Guinness, but I'm not a massive Guinness drinker. You have a drink of Guinness or you have a drink of wine. And because it's a nice evening and there are lovely people to speak with, you actually permit yourself to really enjoy the experience. So the opioid system kicks in, you get to like it, the wanting kind of like trickles down a little bit, and so you end up feeling satisfied. So you can rest in that sense of enjoyment. And this, incidentally, is one of the reasons why mindfulness, I think, is taking off so much, because we're hyperstimulated on the dopamine side, and we're going, shit, I'm so busy, I'm aroused all the time, but I'm just not reaching the point of feeling that sense of satiety. So all of this is very interesting, but when it comes to habitual products, many of them actually initiate dopamine loops. And this is the final principle that I want to talk with you about now. So dopamine is typically the thing that starts us seeking, and then we get rewarded for that seeking behavior, and so guess what? We continue seeking. So it's a bit of a sort of perpetual cycle. So what happens if you're bored, if you're waiting for someone, if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling a low sense of mood, or emotionally you're feeling a bit anxious? Your dopamine system might kick in and go, oh, I want something that's going to take me out of this unpleasant state. So what do? You take action, you whip out your phone, and then you go on Instagram or Twitter or WhatsApp or any number of things, or Tinder, and you start seeking some rewards. But because the rewards are so small and unpredictable and unsatisfying, the opioid system doesn't have a chance to kick in. So you don't have the opportunity to enjoy it, you don't feel satisfied, and you end up in this perpetual loop of just seeking. You're like, I must have more. How many of you really recognize this feeling? I do, and I'm quite conscious of what's happening. You're going, shit, I shouldn't be doing this. Before you know it, half an hour's gone, and your life is just awful because you're too busy following tweets of people that look happier than you, or whatever it is. Maybe that's just me. So what's actually happening when we're sort of in this, it's kind of like a hamster wheel of misery and arousal, which is not a great combination. The first thing is that we actually seek more than we are satisfied. Evolutionarily speaking, some people think that this is because those of us who are greater seekers were more likely to innovate and find better and more creative ways to survive. If you're complacent, you sit down, you get eaten by a lion, sorry, your genes are not going to get passed on. Another interesting thing to note when we're looking at dopamine loops is that brain activity patterns tend to be higher when we're anticipating a reward versus when we're actually receiving that reward. So if you're thinking about that fabulous date, or you're planning that amazing holiday, or you're, getting dressed to go out to a club, or whatever it is that you're doing, when you're anticipating it and you're fantasizing about it, in many ways, you'll get a greater dopamine reward than when you're actually there enjoying it, right? And then you kind of go, shit, I was looking forward to this. Why is this so not satisfying? Again, take a few deep breaths, get into it, have a couple of drinks, you'll be fine. But you have to let the opioid system kick in. What triggers dopamine system are external cues. So things like haptic notifications, a buzz of a pocket, buzz of a phone, or whatever it is in your pocket, or a ping, or a visual cue. You get the little notification on your home screen, which is why so many people remove all of these triggers so that they can actually get their work done and live a little. The other two things that actually enable this dopamine loop process to happen, small rewards and unpredictable rewards. So for instance, if we all play the game of checking our inboxes in the morning or halfway through the night, you go, oh, I might have gotten some amazing thing come in my inbox. When was the last time anything that exciting came into your inbox? Never, practically. I mean, it's really, and yet we engage in this behavior. And research has found that with things like rats and pigeons, the highest response rate in anticipation of reward comes when that reward is small and when we don't know when it's happening. So, just FYI. So whatever the device that you're optimizing for, you have to understand the psychological biases and motivations that are driving your customers and what the best way of applying those in the design on whatever device is going to be. But there is one thing that I think is really important to note, and this is that when we are trying to persuade, we have to think about how we are deploying these sorts of psychological principles and why. I would say that there is a spectrum of ethical use of these sorts of things. At the one end, you have facilitation, which is win-win. Your customers are happy, like Talia was saying, they're getting what they want. You're giving them a better, more enjoyable experience. And that essentially is persuasion for good, facilitation, sustainable success. At the other end is coercion. And this is when you're basically going, sod the customer, I don't care what they're doing or what their needs are. We're going to try and hack their systems, get them into dopamine loops, and make sure that they're engaging in an unhealthy way that they'll eventually get fed up with, but at least we get a spike in conversions, at least initially. It's manipulative, and it's generally not going to work in the long term. So as marketers, designers, and developers, we're actually both the architects and the users of all of our future tech. And so when we're employing these amazing principles and these CRO practices, I think it's nice if we can ask the question, what kind of world do you want to build? Thank you very much for your time.